Welcome back to the shop and to the channel. We are finally getting back to work on this Kearney and Trecker universal adjustable milling attachment for the horizontal mill. I have all of the castings cleaned up and painted. They're not, showroom quality by any stretch, but they'll do for me anyway. I also have all the hardware cleaned up, and I put them in these little dollar store plastic containers. I pick them up pretty cheap. I was able to find most of the bearings, new bearing replacements, so we've got those to put in as well. There were a couple of bearings that I wasn't able to replace, but we'll talk about those when we get there. Start by assembling this piece, which is called the attachment drive gear housing. Now this is really the first piece that goes on the mill, and it houses the driven gear that drives the milling head, and it's driven by the drive gear, which would be mounted in the spindle. It's been such a long time since I took this apart that I'm going to be referencing this exploded diagram and probably taking breaks from time to time to go review the video that I took when I took it apart. Unfortunately, I have a tendency to kind of get in the moment when I'm disassembling these things, and recording them on video is great, but sometimes I wish I would put a little more detail in the video. It would certainly help me figure out how it goes back together. And this was no different. There were a couple of things in here that I had to really study to figure out how it went back together. I am taking the time to run a tap through anything that's threaded, just to be sure that there's no leftover gunk down in there. And there certainly will be if I don't do this. This thing was so filthy on the inside. I'll link to some videos in the description of me taking this thing apart. It was so bad, I'm surprised that I was actually even able to get it as clean as it is. And doing this by hand is going to take too long, so I'm going to go get my drill and get through these things a little bit faster. This thing has a couple of grease zerks on the side, and so I do have an NPT tap here that I'm using to clean those threads out as well. Now this part of the milling attachment only has 2 zerk fittings in it, but I believe there's no less than 8 in this whole thing. And I believe some of them are intended for grease, and there's a couple that are intended for oil, although I still question that. But again, we'll kind of talk about that when I get to that part. Now this is one of the parts in which I have to go back and revisit the video. There's this bearing retainer that sits on the casting, but there's also a couple of other parts that go on here, and it really wasn't clear from the exploded parts diagram on how it went together. So I'm going to have to go back and look at the original video of disassembly just to see how this went together. Well, after going back and looking at the video and then looking at the parts again here, I think I've got a good understanding of how this goes together. We'll start with the simple part. There's this bearing that gets seated down into this bearing retainer. Now this mounts to the inside of the bracket. With that new bearing mounted in the retainer, it's held in with a snap ring. I'm going to set that aside for a minute so I can go ahead and mount this larger bearing with an external snap ring in it into the main casting. I'm pretty sure that this bearing gets greased, so I'm going to use some mobile EP1. This is a brown lithium grease. This is the same stuff that I used in the head of the Bridgeport, so I think it will work here. Considering that gargoyle grease is long since out of production, I don't even know where I'd find it or anything like it, but this, after consulting with a couple of friends more knowledgeable than me, this should be a good substitute grease for this application. With that bearing seated and all greased up, I can put the retaining plate on, and then on top of the bearing retainer is an oil slinger and a oil retainer, and these all get sandwiched together and screwed into the bracket. Well, with that done, I can turn this over now and install the driven gear. Now there's a snap ring that goes onto the top of that driven gear, and it's got to come all the way through that retainer plate, and it's not coming all the way through. I'm not exactly sure where the issue is, but I want to go ahead and take this retainer off so I might be able to see what the issue is. Well, that oil slinger doesn't want to seem to go over top of the shaft of the gear. I think that the snap ring goes essentially on top of that into the groove. I think it's going to be easier if I take this thing back out of the bracket and I assemble this a little differently. There's no manual for this, though. I'm kind of trying to figure this out as I go. Yeah, so I think I'm going to just drive that bearing back out with the driven gear. I think it'll be pretty easy to get back out, and then I'll just assemble all of this separately and then put it back in the bracket. I think it's going to be a lot easier to get this snap ring on here this way than it was trying to do it in the bracket with nothing to support that driven gear from behind. When I come back to that first bearing and the retainer, put a little grease on it and insert the drive shaft that I made some time ago. This is a nice close fit in the center of that bearing. Well, I try not to put things together completely dry, so I'll put a little bit of lubricant. I'll just use some of this EP1 grease on the drive shaft first. I'll slide the drive shaft in through the driven gear and then attach it with 5 screws from behind. The last piece to install here on the bracket is this swivel clamp. What this does is when the swivel and the swivel support bracket are not in an extended position, this will clamp them together to keep them from moving. I'm going to do here on the bracket. It's complete except for the clamping gibs that go on the left and the right. I'll put those on when I get ready to install this back onto the machine. Well, the next part I'm going to work on is this swivel support bracket. There's quite a few things going on inside of here, and it slides onto that drive shaft with this sliding sleeve, and this is a part that I did some repair work on in a previous video. Well, I think I did an okay job cleaning all of the dried up grease that was inside of this thing. So I think it's ready to go back on. You might recall this is the piece that's got a couple of cracks in it. I don't think the cracks are critical. I tried to braze them and failed. I think at some point in the future, I'll probably take this thing back apart again and get this thing brazed up the right way, either by me once I learn a little bit more, or by maybe somebody knows what the hell they're doing. In order to do the repair work to this drive gear sleeve, I had to disassemble the parts that were on it, including this bevel gear and a bearing. And now that we are reassembling everything, I can put this back up in the arbor press and get it pressed back together. Well, with that bevel gear pressed on, the next thing that has to go on is a bearing. But before I press it on, I want to go ahead and pack it full of this EP1 grease. Before the bearing is pressed on, I need to install this bearing retainer, and then I can press the drive gear sleeve into this main bearing. Now there's a few parts here that go in to the swivel support bracket before that sliding shaft, and one is this oil slinger. It goes in first. And then there's this washer that goes on top of the oil slinger. Now I'm ready to install the drive gear sleeve assembly into the swivel support bracket. Drive the bearing here home using that little test drive shaft that I made some time ago. This thing's come in handy in more than a few occasions. There are 6 lock washers and 6 nuts that fasten the bearing retainer here on the sliding gear sleeve to some studs that are already installed in the swivel support bracket. On the opposite end of the drive gear sleeve, I need to put in this lock washer and this lock nut. Well, it's going to be a lot easier to secure this lock nut onto the drive gear sleeve if I mount it up in a vise. I've got some rubber soft jaws in my vise, and I've just got to clamp down in there. I don't have any kind of a driver to install this, so I'll get it as tight as I can by hand, and then I guess I'll have to resort to using a punch and a hammer to try to get it torqued down to the right tightness. I don't really know exactly how tight this thing is supposed to be, if there's some torque rating, but what I did do is I went back and looked at the disassembly video as close as I could to see if I could determine how far down on the threads this lock nut was. So I'm just going to drive it until it looks like it's about as far on as it was in the original video. Well, that looks about right, and this one notch here is lined up with the tab that appears it was the one that was bent up into it before. I do need to straighten it out a little bit here with a punch, but I'll get it bent up so it seats inside that notch. That'll keep this thing from ever backing off. Well, that is complete now. I can slide the swivel support bracket now over top of the drive shaft. Well, it slides over there nicely. It's a little snug there at the end. I'm not sure exactly what would cause that, but the shaft spins nice and free, so I think we're in good shape. Well, you can see how this swivel clamp works. I just pivot it up into the notch on the swivel support bracket and tighten down this nut, and that prevents it from sliding on the drive shaft. Well, I'm happy with the progress so far, but unfortunately that's really all the time I had to spend out in the shop this weekend, so we're going to have to call it quits for now. If you like the video, I'd appreciate it if you give it a thumbs up. Maybe leave a comment. That certainly helps with YouTube algorithm in getting this video out there to other people so they can discover it. I do appreciate you watching the video, and I especially appreciate those that have contributed to this project, both through commenting and liking and sharing the video, as well as those have been able to contribute financially as well. Well, next up will be the swivel and the milling head itself. So hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell icon so you'll know when the next batch of videos gets dropped and you won't miss a thing. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.